Okay, we've all heard of Nintendo at this point. They're a fairly iconic company with equally iconic franchises and characters to back their status as one of the more prominent companies in the entertainment industry. A character like Mario has grown into such a recognizable character that he's practically become a household name at this point. You would be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know who this is. Most people would similarly be able to recognize the likes of Pikachu or Donkey Kong. The more dedicated fans would be able to tell you about Kirby, and the truest, most elite gamers would be able to tell you that this is in fact Link and not Zelda. Suffice it to say that Nintendo has put out some of the most recognizable games in video game history, and while I could discuss these titles and characters at great length, today I want to shine a light on one of the lesser known franchises to come from Nintendo. Mother, also commonly known as the EarthBound series, exists as sort of the black sheep of Nintendo's catalog. While it certainly has its core group of fans, even proud members of the game's cult following would surely agree that this franchise is comparatively forgotten. I would even hesitate to use the term forgotten here, as that would imply that it was well known to begin with, when in reality, Mother is a series that largely flew under the radar when compared to its contemporaries. This is especially true with American audiences for reasons which I'll discuss later. But I'm willing to bet that some of the very people watching this video are unfamiliar with Mother, and frankly, I wouldn't blame them. I've had friends ask me about the video I was working on, and when I told them it was going to be about Mother, they had no idea what I was talking about. When I told them it was the series that gave us Ness from Super Smash Bros., it immediately cleared up the confusion, because while EarthBound did find success in its own right, its relevancy is kept intact largely due to the appearance of some of the franchise's protagonists, those being Ness and Lucas, in the Super Smash Bros. Series. While Lucas wouldn't appear until the series' third iteration with Brawl, Ness was available from the very beginning as a hidden character that was waiting to be unlocked. This is a bit of a detour, but stick with me here. Smash 64 was one of my favorite games as a kid, but I remember I was never quite able to figure out how to unlock Ness. I had unlocked every other hidden character in the game, but had no idea who was hiding behind that last hidden question mark, nor did I know what feat had to be accomplished in order to unlock them. Years later, I succumbed to my own curiosity and decided to just look it up. It turned out that you had to play through Classic mode with 3 stocks or less. While this is what the game defaults you to, I immediately noticed that I could raise my stock count to 5 as a kid, and never thought to play with anything less than that. If I wanted a challenge, I'd simply raise the difficulty rather than lower the stock count. So when I finally obtained the information on how to unlock this mysterious final character, I set out to do just that. I was giddy with anticipation, wondering which Nintendo icon would occupy this final slot in the roster. Then I saw Ness and was, well, a bit disappointed. Not only did I have no idea who this dorky kid on my screen was, I also wasn't very fond of his moveset. Ness always struck me as a bland, boring, and kind of weird character, and at that point I had spent literal years playing the game and learning what the other characters had to offer. So when I sat down to play the game, I saw no reason to pick Ness over the likes of Pikachu or Captain Falcon, who struck me as way more interesting. While I did try to give Ness a chance, I remember thinking his stage recovery was especially egregious, and anyone who's tried to recover with PK Thunder knows exactly what I mean by this. But if you don't, just trust me, it's weird. So I dismissed him as a pretty trash character and moved on with my life. A few years down the road, I was playing Brawl with some friends, and I chose the random character option, and of course I was given Ness. I let out a groan of disappointment since I was given one of my least favorite characters in the game, but it was in that match that I discovered something particularly special about Ness. Something revolutionary, in fact. What I saw Ness do would not only change my perception of the character, but my perception of the game altogether. Take a look at this clip. Did you see it? I'll play that last part back again. Yes, that! That is what I had been missing in my life. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. What I discovered on that fateful day was the perfect taunt. Okay? You're right, Ness. It is okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It doesn't get better than this. Just listen to the way that he says it. The raw disdain in his tone. He throws a question mark on the end, giving it a scathing edge of sarcasm. Look, I know it might seem like I'm overreacting to this taunt, but just picture this for a second. You're winning the game, you have a clear lead and things are going your way, victory is within your grasp, And then you get hit by a stray PK fire, which is then converted into a deadly combo. Your character is then tossed off the stage, and there goes your lead along with your final stock. You're seeping with rage, dripped in salt, watching as your favorite character flies off into the distant background of the screen. And as this happens, at the peak of your anger, when all you want to do is yell out in frustration, this little kid who caused you so much pain stops, faces you. Yeah, you! He breaks the fourth wall, facing you, the player, and just goes, "Okay? Oh, you're mad? Okay? Oh, you thought you had that game in the bag? Okay?" God, this taunt is a gem. It's short enough that you can just spam it at them like 5 times after you get a kill. It is truly remarkable. If you've ever played Smash Bros with me, then you probably know that Ness is actually my main now. I wish I could tell you that I chose this character because I liked his design, or because his moveset resonated with me, or better yet, because I was a big fan of the game he's from, but the truth is, I main Ness because I fell in love with his taunt. I recognize that it's a rather petty reason, but something about this display of pure toxicity inspired me enough to practice the character to overcome his abysmal stage recovery, which I had previously struggled with, and I would work to learn the basic combos, hone my skills, and today I would say that he is without a doubt my best character in the game. And although I initially wanted nothing to do with this kid, he's slowly grown to become one of my favorite video game characters ever, and it's all thanks to Smash. But that's kinda weird, right? I mean, he's one of my favorite characters, and yet I've never played any of the games in his series. I had this sudden realization that I know surprisingly little about someone I deem to be one of my favorites. I felt like a fraud, an imposter. One might even call me a fake fan, and understandably so, but am I really to blame in all this? You see, there's something noticeably different about Ness, and even Lucas for that matter, that distinguishes them from the other characters on the Smash roster. While I felt bad about not knowing more about them, the truth is that I was never meant to know more about them. You see, I don't necessarily think it was Nintendo's intention for players to immediately recognize every character on the roster. If you did, that's great, but if you're like me, you probably recognized a handful of them the first time you played, but didn't know much about some of the others. When I sat down and played Smash 64 for the first time, I knew Mario, Donkey Kong, Yoshi, and Pikachu, but Samus, Fox, Kirby, and even Link were unfamiliar to me at the time. Smash Bros is the game that introduced me to those characters. In a way, Smash Bros was Nintendo's strategy to unify their fan base and introduce them to some of their other titles. And it was a pretty effective strategy. The next time I went to a game store and saw Link on the cover of a Zelda case, I remembered him from Smash Bros and wanted to buy the game to know more about where he came from. But this experience isn't one I could ever have with Ness and Mother because these games didn't exist in America for a long time. And when I say a long time, I mean over 25 years after the initial release. See, Mother was initially planned for release outside of Japan, but seeing that Nintendo would soon be releasing the SNES, they didn't see it as a viable strategy to promote an NES title overseas. So we wouldn't receive the title until it was released on the Wii U Virtual Console in 2015. While the sequel, EarthBound, was released in America shortly after its Japan release, it didn't receive much promotion in America and went largely unnoticed at the time. Then, of course, there's Mother 3, which still to this day has not received any official localization. All of this is to say that I didn't grow up with these games because, well, I was never going to just find them laying around at my local GameStop. Still, as I mentioned before, Mother has amassed a cult following, and this dedicated group worked to provide others with an English fan translation of the series' first installment, Mother 1, which allowed for easy online access to those who never got to experience the game. The translation was called EarthBound 0. Upon discovering that I finally had the means to play through the game, I knew what I had to do. It was the only way that I could win back the right to harass others with my favorite taunt and redeem my status as a Ness main. Then I learned that Ness doesn't actually appear in the series until the sequel, and you instead play as this Ness lookalike named Ninten. But forget that for now, we'll get to him later. Thus, I set out on a journey to play through Mother and decided I'd log my experiences, thoughts, and opinions to share with you all. I played EarthBound 0. Then I took a really long hiatus from YouTube and played EarthBound 0 a second time to get in the right frame of mind to make this video. If you couldn't tell by now, from what has already been a very lengthy intro, I have a lot to say about this game, for better or worse. So strap in, grab yourself a snack, and hang out as I cover this relic of Nintendo's history. This is going to be the ultimate retrospective analysis of Mother. Okay? Before we delve too deep into the inner workings of this game, I think we should start with the basics. What is Mother? Simply put, Mother is a JRPG or Japanese role-playing game released by Nintendo in 1989. If I asked you to think back to 1989, I'm willing to bet that many of my viewers wouldn't be able to, as they either were not born yet or were too young at the time to remember it clearly. If you can remember, kudos to you, but I certainly cannot, as I wouldn't be born for another 10 years. It's baffling to think that this game was released when my parents were younger than I am today, but I digress. I think it goes without saying that the late 80s were a considerably different time. The culture was different, the politics were different, the socioeconomic concerns were different, and all these factors which distinguish that time period from our own are important considerations when analyzing a game like Mother. These bits of late 80s influence are ever present in the design of the game and the world which it establishes. I remember reading something before downloading the game that cautioned players against approaching the game with modern standards in mind. Mother is not a 21st century game and shouldn't be approached as such. Put yourself in the shoes of a kid in the late 20th century. Imagine getting out of school on a Friday afternoon and stopping by a video game rental store, an industry that was relatively new at the time. Perhaps you've already overcome some of the more popular titles and you were in search of a new adventure. Then you see a game you've never heard of called Mother, and you figure, what the hell, might as well see what this is about. You give your money to the clerk and head home to embark on a new adventure for the weekend. If you sit down to play this game comparing it to something like Breath of the Wild, you'll be guaranteed to have a pretty miserable experience. But if you can recapture this feeling, this sense of wonder that predates the technological innovations of modern society, you may just be able to appreciate the game in the way which it was intended to be enjoyed. To really understand this game and engage in an in-depth discussion on it, it's important that we address the game's unique development journey. The story of Mother is largely the story of one man, Shigesato Itoi, the game's creator. When conducting research on the game, I stumbled across an interview with Itoi conducted by Keiichi Tanaka where they discussed Mother's development. The interview was then converted into a comic panel for reasons, I don't know, it was kinda weird but also kinda cool. I'll link the comic in the description of the video if you're interested, but for now I'll feature the panels as I describe the game's development. Shigesato Itoi worked as a copywriter in Japan. In his youth, Itoi would develop a severe case of asthma. He described his struggles to be so intense that he would suffer severe coughing fits if he wasn't sitting upright. To combat this unfortunate situation, Itoi would turn to video games as a way to occupy his time and get him through it all. He grew particularly fond of Super Mario and would play it for hours. While he wasn't initially interested in the RPG genre, his stance would shift after he experienced Dragon Quest, an RPG that would immediately have him hooked. Amazed by his experiences in gaming, Itoi grew to become simultaneously inspired by and jealous of game creators. He strived to create his own masterpiece in the gaming industry, using the titles which he played as inspiration for the process. Itoi began to notice a pattern in the RPGs of the time. It seemed that nearly every RPG would feature a chosen hero in some sort of old-timey setting with swords, shields, armor, and magic. Itoi was confused as to why this medieval-esque setting was the standard as seen in games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. Instead, he wondered what an RPG designed by Steven Spielberg, one of his favorite movie producers, would be like. Spielberg's work was often based around child protagonists who would have to band together to overcome some sort of paranormal force. Thus, Itoi would begin to draft ideas he had about an RPG based around the idea of kids in a modern setting fighting against paranormal alien activity. These ideas would of course serve as the origins for a game that would come to be known as Mother. Itoi worked fairly hard on his idea, striving to think of unique characters and an interesting story that the game could be based around. However, despite his hard work, Itoi had no connections in the video game industry. He was simply working alone on a project from home with nobody to show his ideas to. Thus, it seemed as though his ideas were not going anywhere anytime soon. Through completely unrelated circumstances, Itoi happened to be featured on a television program that was discussing the Nintendo Famicom. He described his fascination with Mario and how it got him through hard times, while reveling in the prospect of a big future for the video game industry. What Itoi didn't know at the time was that among the program's many viewers was the president of Nintendo himself. Nintendo would reach out to Itoi, setting up a meeting. They wanted Itoi's advice and opinion on one of their upcoming titles. Itoi saw this as the big break he was looking for, so he attended the meeting, bringing with him a copy of his drafts and notes for the game he had been working on. While at Nintendo, Itoi met Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario. He decided to show his work to Miyamoto in the hopes that his game would be taken on by Nintendo. Miyamoto's response was less than enthusiastic, and Itoi recalls him seeming somewhat unimpressed. Miyamoto told Itoi that he had to think on it, but the company would be in touch if they decided to move forward with the game. Itoi felt as though he was at a low point, believing he had blown his only shot at an opportunity he had already poured countless hours into. Racked with grief and despair, he found himself crying on the train ride back home, feeling as though he had ruined his chances at accomplishing his dream. Months would pass by, and although Itoi had grown fairly sure that he had missed his opportunity, he received the long-awaited call from Nintendo saying that they would in fact move forward with producing his game. Itoi made a few unique and clever decisions in the game's design during its development which would set the title apart from anything the world had seen before. He strived to bring his own sense of humor to the game. Things like wittiness, jokes, wordplay, and comedy were relatively unexplored in video games at the time, so this was a fresh approach for Mother to explore that allowed it to feel different and resonate with a new audience. Itoi wanted to create a deeper connection with his player base than most other developers had established with theirs. Thus, many of his design choices were aimed at this goal. Itoi would take inspiration from a comedy film from the late 60s called The Tigers, The World's Waiting for Us. In the movie, the main characters form a band and perform in a final clash against an alien invasion. I've never seen the movie and it sounds kind of weird, but apparently during the final battle, one of the main characters breaks the fourth wall and asks the audience to join the fight by singing along with them. This moment in particular inspired Itoi to find his own way of drawing fans in and engaging them with the experience, so his game was designed in a way that would attempt to break the barrier separating the player from the game. Many players at the time felt a sense of immersion which they hadn't felt with any other games of the era. When the game was finally completed and was released to the public, it wasn't exactly a commercial success. It wasn't a failure either, but it simply didn't live up to the standards of some of Nintendo's titans. That said, those who did play the game received it well, setting the foundation for a dedicated fanbase and 2 sequels. Thus, despite its lack of time in the spotlight, Mother's unique approach allowed it to find success in its own right. Mother's appeal is largely due to the way in which its characters were designed and presented to the player. Most entertainment sources in the era featured incredibly strong and unrealistically tough adult figures as the hero who saves the day, but Mother aimed to foster relatability by taking a different approach in its character design. While we could all aspire to be Superman, the truth is that most of us were simply average kids at some point. The vast majority of media outlets reinforce the narrative of adults holding all the power, while kids are generally sidelined and dismissed as being incapable of creating meaningful change. I mean, don't get me wrong, we always hear the cliche expression about kids being able to do anything they want, but this is always accompanied by the implication that they can do or be whatever they want when they grow up. But what are kids capable of accomplishing as kids? Mother aims to answer this very question. In a world that constantly underestimates and undervalues the role of children, Mother is a breath of fresh air, showing you that you don't necessarily need to be some grown-up, tough, godlike figure to create change in the world. Remember, Itoi's vision was based around the Spielbergian notion of children filling the protagonist role to overcome seemingly impossible odds. This vision would be fulfilled through a group of 4 ragtag misfits who would embark on the hero's journey and grow to become friends along the way. The first of these kids is a 12-year-old boy named Ninten. The moment that I met Ninten was also the moment that I realized I wouldn't meet Ness until the game's sequel, so I was already a bit disappointed upon meeting Mother's main character. But hey, Ninten gets the job done too, I suppose. What is there to really say about Ninten? He's your average silent protagonist hero figure. There really isn't a whole lot I could mention about his personality because, well, again, he's a silent protagonist. He doesn't really say much, but Ninten is the embodiment of actions speaking louder than words. He's generally well liked by most people he encounters, and that's because you can tell through his actions that he's kind-hearted and always willing to help out where he can. This can be seen as the game's plot events begin to unfold. For example, when a little girl named Pippi goes missing, Ninten sets out to check a nearby graveyard where he discovers she's been trapped. He frees her and escorts her back to safety. When he encounters a baby canary, he chooses to locate the bird's mother and return it home. Ninten generally tries to help anyone in need, even going so far as to talk a janitor through his marital issues, which is kind of a lot of pressure for that janitor put on a 12-year-old, but I guess that's nothing compared to the pressure of having to literally save the world, which, spoiler alert, Ninten does, because in this world he's kind of the ultimate archetype of a good guy, and that's really the main thing you need to know about his character. At some point on his journey, Ninten encounters a kid named Lloyd. Lloyd is your classic nerd character. He's pretty weak and a bit of a social outcast, but he's also the first friend you make on your journey. If I'm being honest, Lloyd is a little bit of a weirdo. You could call me judgmental for saying so, but in my defense, you meet the kid while he's hanging out in a trash can. And you could maybe try to argue that maybe he's here because a bully put him in the trash can, which is a valid argument, but considering the fact that Lloyd's dad is also hanging out in a trash can when you meet him, I think the implication is pretty clear. Lloyd voluntarily hangs out in trash cans for fun. And I mean, to each their own, you can do whatever you want, but just know that if I catch you spending your free time inside of a trash can, I might make a comment. That's all I'm saying. Unfortunately for Lloyd, most of the other kids at his school share that sentiment and tend to pick on him a bit. But Ninten's the first kid who actually doesn't bully Lloyd, leading to the start of a pretty wholesome friendship. Unlike the other members of the team, Lloyd doesn't really have much of a reason to go on the adventure other than him simply wanting to hang out with his new friend Ninten, which is kinda sweet in its own way. What Lloyd lacks in coolness, he more than makes up for in intelligence and practicality, with a strong enthusiasm for science. These skills make him a surprisingly useful addition to the team. When the path is blocked by boulders, Lloyd is able to use bottle rockets to pave a way through. When the group needs to cross a lake, Lloyd is able to repair a nearby boat with a busted engine, allowing for a safe traveling option. Although he's a bit wimpy when you first meet him, Lloyd's character arc is all about him gaining confidence through his new friends. It's pretty wholesome, and I personally think it's actually the strongest character arc in the game. Next up, you have Anna. She's a young girl who's incredibly gifted with her psychic powers. Before officially ever meeting Ninten, she actually foretold his arrival through a psychic vision. When you meet Anna, she tells the player that her mother had mysteriously vanished one day and she was hoping to find her. So Anna joins the team in the hopes of solving the mystery of her mother's disappearance. Anna is probably the most boring one out of the main protagonists, if I'm being honest. I mean, conceptually, she's pretty cool, but the game doesn't really do a great job of giving her much of a personality or a character arc to follow. Don't get me wrong, she's actually a very useful member of the team, quite possibly being the most useful member of the team in terms of gameplay, for reasons I'll get to later, so she's definitely a welcome presence. I just wish I had more to say about her. She's pretty bland. They sort of threw in a romance between Anna and Ninten at the end of the game, but it feels super forced and unnecessary, especially considering she only gets like 2 bits of dialogue in the whole game. I don't know. Anna's cool, it just feels like her character was kinda underdeveloped. But with that, we come to the last main protagonist, Teddy. Teddy essentially fills the tough guy role for the team. You don't get off to the best start with him though. You see, Teddy, and bear with me here, Teddy actually runs his own gang, and not just any gang, he runs the Blah Blah Gang. Stupid name aside, they're one of the more infamous gangs in the world of Mother, and their constant troublemaking makes them a target for Ninten and his moral compass. So you actually meet Teddy when he confronts you in the club for messing with his boys. It's pretty wild, and this confrontation actually escalates into a fist fight between Ninten and Teddy. By the end of the fight, Teddy grows to respect Ninten's toughness and asks to join his team. You know how kids will handle people who mess with them by threatening to call their big brother on them? Teddy's basically the big brother in this game. He's a fair bit older than the others and is certainly stronger, so in combat he acts as the physical powerhouse for the team. Despite his nonchalant tough guy persona, Teddy does seem to care about the team in his own way. When you first meet him, he temporarily kicks Lloyd off the team. While this seems kinda aggressive at first, he actually does this out of a fear for Lloyd's safety, since the next destination on the journey is the very location where Teddy's parents were killed, and he didn't really think Lloyd was tough enough to keep up with the enemies you could find there. Teddy reveals that whatever supernatural forces are taking over the world are actually the cause of his parents' death, and he sees it as his mission to avenge them. While it's a fairly common trope for RPGs to let players name the playable character, Mother takes this feature a step further by allowing the player to name the entirety of the main cast. This adds a fun layer of personalization to the experience. You can name the team members after your friends, and suddenly the game becomes an imaginative journey that you and your friends are embarking on together. While I obviously chose to name Ninten after myself, I decided to base the others' names on the gamertags of my childhood friend circle, all people who have appeared on the channel at one point or another. Lloyd was named Arch after my friend Archwing Dragon, Anna was named Carp after level 5 Magikarps, and Teddy was named Divine after my older brother Divine AV. As I played through the game, I'd keep them updated on funny things their characters did or said, and it was always pretty enjoyable drawing parallels between the characters and their real-life counterparts. Lloyd's occasional awkwardness lined up well with Archwing's own occasional awkward tendencies. Anna's psychic prowess corresponded well with Magikarp's insistence on always being the mage in whatever game we play together, and Teddy's toughness fit pretty well with my brother since we always kind of looked at him as the tough guy in our own group growing up. And remember how I said Teddy ends up acting like a big brother type figure? Huh, kind of fitting. But truthfully, I named the characters before I knew anything about them, which was part of the fun. I got to watch how my friends compared to their in-game counterparts over time. Of course, this made the romance sequence between Ninten and Anna a bit awkward to explain to the homies, but aside from that, it was a lot of fun. And I know that this is all anecdotal, but that was just my experience with the simple feature. I'm sure others who played the game at the time had their own similar stories and experiences with this. I know it's a pretty trivial detail by modern standards, but I'm sure this was pretty cool and unique at the time of the game's release. Itoy wanted to draw players in by crafting characters they could relate to, and I'd certainly say he succeeded on this front. So by now I've talked a fair bit about the wondrous journey the game sends you on and the mysterious forces at play in the world it establishes. But what exactly does this journey entail? What are these forces at work? This feels like an appropriate time to dive into the plot of the game. 30 years before the game's events begin to unfold, a man named George and his wife Maria mysteriously disappeared without a trace. 2 years later, George suddenly returned, but Maria was never seen or heard from again. Upon returning, George confined himself to the basement of his house to begin conducting some fairly intense studies on a psychic phenomenon he had discovered in his absence. These psychic abilities would come to be known as PSI, and George's research would essentially set the foundation for the world's understanding of such powers. Flash forward 30 years to 1988, where George's grandson Ninten is ready to begin his adventure. On a seemingly ordinary day, Ninten's home is suddenly attacked by strange paranormal forces. Ninten defends his house from the forces and learns that similar occurrences have been happening around the world. This paranormal activity has caused some strange things to take place, such as a dramatic increase in animal hostility and the sudden disappearance of several people. Ninten's father informs him that his grandfather, George, used to study psychic abilities in the basement and suggests that his research could help explain these strange occurrences. So Ninten heads to the basement to retrieve his grandfather's old research journal before setting out to save the world from the mysterious forces. While journeying along, Ninten solves some of the issues brought about by the paranormal activity in the next town over. Eventually, with the help of his grandfather's journal, Ninten manages to arrive at Magicant, a mysterious world of, well, magic. Everyone in Magicant talks about the land's queen, Queen Mary, and her legendary song. After meeting with Queen Mary, Ninten learns that the queen has lost her memory and is unable to remember the song. She requests Ninten's help, asking that he returns to Earth to locate the 8 melodies which the song is comprised of. Once Ninten has learned the 8 melodies, he is to return to remind Queen Mary of her song. Through his searches, Ninten meets and befriends Lloyd, Anna, and Teddy, who each decide to join the team for different reasons. Lloyd to repay the kindness Ninten has shown to him, Anna to locate her mother who had suddenly disappeared, and Teddy to avenge his parents' death at the hands of the paranormal forces. Upon joining the team, Teddy directs the team's search to Mount Itoy, where his parents were killed. He advises Lloyd to stay behind, as he didn't think Lloyd would be tough enough to handle the tough opponents at Mount Itoy. Still, the enemies would prove to be too powerful for the team, wiping out the squad and severely injuring Teddy in the process. Surprisingly, it's actually Lloyd who comes to the team's rescue, taking them to safety and rejoining the team while Teddy recovers from his injuries. With a brand new resolve, the group decides to take on Mount Itoy once again. Their quest up the mountain would eventually lead them to a research lab. Here they discover a robot named Eve, who was programmed by George to protect Ninten at all costs. With Eve's help, the group manages to make their way up the rest of the mountain while fending off the evil forces. However, near the mountain's peak, Eve would be destroyed while defending the group from a particularly strong opponent. Eve's body contained one of Queen Mary's melodies, with the 8th and final melody being located at the mountain's peak. Upon retrieving the final melody, Ninten returns to Magicant as instructed to remind Queen Mary of her song. Upon remembering her song, Queen Mary's memory suddenly returned. She is then revealed to be none other than Maria, George's wife who had been missing for decades, aka Ninten's grandmother. With her memories returned, she is able to remember her disappearance, which she attributes to an alien abduction. While discussing her time away, Maria recalls an alien named Gyagis, who she raised like a son during her captivity. After she reveals this to Ninten, Magicant suddenly fades away into nothingness, and it's revealed that Magicant was, bear with me here, a manifestation of Maria's consciousness? Yeah, I don't know. I don't really get it either. That's just what the game says. So now that Magicant has been thoroughly Thanos snapped out of existence, the gang returns to the peak of Mount Itoy where they discover an alien mothership. As it turns out, the aliens are the cause of the mysterious forces that have been taking place lately. Inside the ship, they discover several abducted humans. They discover that the captain of the mothership is none other than Giagis, who has now grown up to become the leader of the alien invasion. Giagis reveals that 30 years ago, when George was captured, he stole vital information from the alien race that is very valuable. It's very likely that the information George stole was information on PSI abilities, but I don't think the game actually ever confirms this. So, Giagis's alien invasion came to Earth in an attempt to destroy the information that George stole. Now that I say it out loud, it's kind of weird that it took them 30 years to launch this invasion. Like, did they just now discover their information was stolen? And if so, don't they realize that whatever George stole is kind of just common knowledge at this point? Like, seriously, 2 of the 3 kids in the group you're talking to are capable of using PSI whenever they feel like it. So you're kind of too late at this point, but whatever. Giagis offers Ninten a chance to leave Earth and join him on the mothership, but Ninten refuses to align himself with the alien invasion. So, Ninten, Lloyd, and Anna engage in one final climactic battle with Giagis. However, they discover that Giagis is too powerful to defeat with force. In an act of desperation, the group begins to sing the 8 melodies they discovered on their journey. As it turns out, the 8 melodies were sung to Giagis as a lullaby by Maria, so hearing the song again strikes a chord with the alien's heart. Overcome with emotion, Giagis retreats while swearing that he'll be back for revenge. The credits roll, and the game has one of those "where are they now" type of sections. Thanks to his heroic endeavors, Lloyd finally gets the praise and recognition he deserves from his peers at school. Anna discovers that her mother was one of the many people who were captured on Giagis's ship, and celebrates the reunion with her mom. Teddy, having avenged his parents, goes on to become a successful singer for reasons. I don't know, but he performs at the club that you meet him in, and I guess that's kinda cool. And finally, Ninten returns home for some well-deserved rest. There's a weird post-credits scene where a man is seen requesting Ninten's help with something, which would hint at a potential sequel. While the game obviously did receive 2 sequels, neither of them feature Ninten or continue his story, so this kinda acts as a loose end in the overall EarthBound universe. But yeah, that is the story of Mother. Upon sitting down with this game for the first time, the word that immediately came to mind was charm. Everything about this beautifully crafted world provided layers upon layers of charm, and this can be seen on nearly every level. Mother's soundtrack captures this wondrous sense of nostalgia that somehow manages to make me yearn for a time that I was never even really around for. The tunes really capture the feeling of simpler times, in a way that can make anyone miss the good old days of just exploring the world as a kid and bullshitting with your friends. It's cute, it's wholesome, it's everything I could ask for neatly wrapped up in a retro style. I've been using the game's OST as background music for this video, and if you're anything like me, I'm willing to bet that as you've been listening, you've probably felt a little nostalgic for your own childhood. Moving beyond the music, Mother's world is crafted in a way that perfectly captures the late 20th century era it was based around. I mean, yeah, there's a pretty big focus on more futuristic sci-fi elements like alien motherships, but the game never comes across as excessively technological in the way that our current society is set up. Aside from Eve, there really isn't a ton in the field of technology, such as televisions, computers, etc. It's just you, your friends, and some of the iconic toys that made your childhood. These toys manifest in the form of weapons in this game. So while most RPGs would have you defend yourself with swords, shields, and a bow, Mother would have you make use of things any other kid would have access to, like baseball bats, boomerangs, and bottle rockets. It's conceptually kinda weird, but it makes sense. What else would a kid really have access to? At times you might find yourself wondering why you're out to save the world with just a baseball bat in hand, but ask yourself this: why would a 12-year-old kid have access to a sword? The game provides you with the tools that you could reasonably expect the cast to have access to. It's worth noting that Teddy actually does fight with bladed weapons like knives and swords, but this makes sense for him since he's a bit older than the others and rough around the edges due to his involvement with the Blah Blah gang. And it makes just as much sense that the other kids rely on things like slingshots and airsoft rifles. It sorta ties into the game's charm and reinforces the notion of kids being able to create change on their own. On a completely separate note, I gotta say, I found myself surprisingly entertained by the game's natural sense of humor. Mother manages to keep a fairly lighthearted and comical tone through most of its duration, with bits of humor shining through in the characters, dialogue, events, and even the circumstances you find yourself in. The game is pretty weird, but it's never afraid to just own that weirdness and lean into it at times. One point of the game features the player walking through a cave full of monkeys that can all talk, and all want to offer advice, but are only able to speak through lies. I don't know, it's weird, but it's also a pretty funny situation to set up. At one point, you can talk to a lady in a nightclub, and she'll offer to buy you a drink, and if you choose to accept the drink, the feds will immediately roll up and throw you in jail, insisting that you reflect on your actions from the corner of your jail cell. In terms of gameplay, this is actually a huge inconvenience, as the officer also takes away your weapons, and ends up being a pretty significant setback, but I'd be lying if I said it did make me laugh the first time I experienced it. You really never know what the NPCs are going to say next, which can make for some situations that are genuinely funny and surprising. In terms of major characters, I gotta say the friendships feel really wholesome to watch develop. Ninten being the first person to support Lloyd rather than bully him is exactly what Lloyd needed to gain self-confidence and courage. Teddy going from being a rather abrasive jerk to looking out for the best interests of the kids who he feels duty-bound to protect is nice to watch unfold. While the Anna and Ninten romance did feel pretty forced, I thought the scene they got where they dance around the room was really cute, and it actually did make me smile. Seeing moments where the group gets to just kick back and have fun will always put a smile on my face, because it's moments like these that really make the game's charm jump out at the player. There's this weird fourth wall break in the game where they'll ask for your real name and not what you chose to name Ninten. At the time it seems pretty random and useless, but after you beat the game and the credits roll, you get this really sweet message where they thank you by name, and it's really nice and memorable. Moments like these really show Itoi's vision of designing a game that develops a deeper connection with the player than others of the time. In terms of world building, I gotta say I was pretty intrigued. Despite hardware limitations heavily restricting how much could be put into the game, I walked away feeling very interested in the world Itoi had set up here. The game doesn't outright explain everything that happens, but instead opts to leave things to the imagination. How did George escape his alien abduction? Why was Maria not able to do the same? What made George decide to steal the alien technology? How was this information popularized over the years? These are some of the questions I found myself wondering about, as the answers seem really interesting, and I think they could all be explored further in the sequels. Whether or not the sequels actually do elaborate on any of these, I'm not sure, but it's interesting regardless. Admittedly, this approach sometimes felt as though they were avoiding answering things because they didn't know how to explain it properly, leading to occurrences that feel underdeveloped, such as the whole magic ant being a manifestation of Maria's consciousness thing. Bits like this feel kinda crammed in there with little to no explanation provided to justify it, but this could probably be chalked up to increasing pressure on the development team to release the game by their established deadline. I will say though that overall, the established world provides players with a sense of wonder, and this feels like an important piece of the game's design philosophy. When you first fight the mysterious Starman opponent in the zoo, you're left wondering what you just encountered. When you first reach Magic Ant, you want to know more about this strange location. When you meet Anna, you're left wondering what happened to her mother. And along those same lines, when you reach Youngtown, you might notice that the town is filled with only children, many of which make comments about missing their parents. The more curious player would probably wonder about this and maybe even draw the connection between Anna's own missing parent. But the game never explicitly tells you what to think or what you should be wondering about. Answers may be provided later, but not all of your questions will always receive answers. At many points, it's up to your own imagination to fill in the gaps and make sense of this strange world you've been sent out to explore. So, the story is simple yet engaging, the characters are wholesome and entertaining, the world building is interesting but just vague enough at points that it leaves you thinking, and the game itself is carefully embedded with strong senses of wonder, care, and nostalgia. If I had to summarize these thoughts in one word, that word would of course be charm. This game is charming. Dare I say this is one of the most charming games I've ever played. However, what I said at the beginning of this section was that charm was the word that came to mind when I first sat down with the game. My thoughts on that have not necessarily changed, but as I proceeded to play the rest of the game, another word began to feel more fitting, more appropriate, and certainly much more prevalent. This word felt darker, more jaded and cynical. As you can see, there's still a good amount of time left in this video, and I'll make this clear right now. Up to this point, I've been very generous in my review of this game, but I have now officially run out of good things to say. From this point onward, I will be going in depth with the bad aspects of the game. And trust me, there are a lot of bad aspects to cover, because now that I've played through this game twice, if I had to describe it in one word, that word would be frustrating. There is an abundance of egregious issues which I take with this game. So many, in fact, that I hardly know where to begin. I suppose it would make sense to start with the first major issue most people will encounter when they sit down to play the game, that being the game's ungodly enemy spawn rate. Like many of its RPG contemporaries, Mother operates as a game in which the player traverses through an overworld while occasionally experiencing an interruption to the journey in the form of a combat scenario. These fights are set to randomly occur as you take steps through certain areas. With every step you take, there is a chance for an enemy to approach and challenge you to a fight which you cannot refuse. For reference, consider a system such as the tall grass in any of the mainline Pokemon games. For every step you take in the tall grass, there's a chance that a wild Pokemon will jump out and attack you. Mother is fairly similar in this regard. However, you will immediately be struck by how ridiculously often these enemy encounters will occur, grinding your sense of progress to a screeching halt. I have no problem with the occasional interruption to engage in combat. I mean, that's practically a staple in the genre at this point. But Mother disrupts your progress in this way to an absurd degree. It isn't all that uncommon to get out of a fight in this game only to immediately enter into another one after taking just a single step. That is the most frustrating feeling in the world, and to make this worse, there are no safe tiles if you're outside of city borders. So while you could easily avoid battles in a game like Pokemon by simply avoiding the tall grass or other designated combat zones, in Mother you'll always run the risk of having all of your progress halted to engage in a meaningless, arbitrary fight, all for rather dismal and petty rewards. Each foray into a new route will result in a never-ending onslaught of enemies to the point that you'll likely spend literal hours in battles you want no part of. It's dreadful, and this issue is made worse by the design of the overworld, which features a lot of winding routes full of twists and turns. The routes and dungeons are often designed in a maze-like fashion, making it near impossible to navigate correctly on your first try. That is to say that you will inevitably get lost while playing through this game. And while getting lost in a video game is already frustrating enough, the constant bombardment of encounters you'll have to suffer through as a direct result of this feels like an added bit of salt in the wound. Nowhere is the issue of a labyrinthian design supplemented by menial enemy encounters more rampant than within Duncan's Factory, one of the most notorious areas in the game. You see, Duncan's Factory is quite possibly the hardest part of the game to navigate because it contains a multitude of branching paths. Each branching path leads you down a hallway, potentially through a door, before eventually leading to a dead end unless you chose the one correct path. This building is huge, and there's only one specific route that you can take to reach the other side of the structure. On top of this, Duncan's Factory doesn't really have many notable landmarks to know if you're going the right way or not. It all sorta blends in and looks the same. It's a bland gray factory with nothing distinguishing its excessive areas apart from perhaps slightly different placement of a ladder or window. When you do stumble upon the correct path to make it through, you'll probably feel a little salty at how incredibly counterintuitive the right path feels. Take a look at this map that was drawn to help guide players through the labyrinth. When you first enter the factory, you can head left or right. Suppose you choose to go right. You'll then enter into a new room that presents the option of going right or down a ladder. So maybe you go down the ladder only to find an item and a dead end. So you backtrack, climb back up the ladder, and continue making your way right. Here you find another room with a probably useless item and a ladder going down. So you go down the ladder and find yet another item box and another dead end. Bear in mind that you'll be facing at least 10 fights on your way through these dead ends, and so you've now wasted a good amount of time, all because you chose to go right when in reality you should have gone left. Now, keep that in mind and watch as I outline the correct path you're supposed to take through this area. How would anybody know how to properly navigate this on their first attempt? You might not even realize how ridiculous this is since you're only looking at a map, but here's the actual footage of me going through Duncan's Factory sped up for convenience's sake. As you can see, it's pretty huge. And I recognize that I'm pointing to the game's worst offender here to make my point, so take that how you will, but trust me when I say that even the simple routes in this game feature paths that lead to nowhere in a similar vein. But at least Duncan's Factory will give you the occasional item to make up for it. Other areas won't always be so generous. So we've established that the constant encounters are a pretty obnoxious issue, and you might be wondering, are there any preventative measures you can take to mitigate this flaw? And the answer is sorta, but not really. While you do always have the option to run away from battles you don't want to participate in, this isn't exactly a solution for a couple reasons. First of all, your chances of successfully escaping the fight when you choose to run feel abysmally low. I don't know the actual odds of escaping from combat by choosing the run option, but it actually felt like it hovered around 20 to 25% in my experience. And if you fail, which you probably will, you get punished in the form of losing your turn in the fight, only to take unnecessary damage on your turn. But even if you do manage to escape the fight, what did you really accomplish? Yeah, you got out of the fight sooner, but this did nothing to stop your progress from being halted, and it still doesn't make the next interruption any less likely. It's worth mentioning that at level 14, Ninten will learn the PSI ability called Fourth Dimension Slip. For the cost of some PSI energy, you'll be guaranteed to escape any battle 100% of the time. This is theoretically what the run function should have been, but even this isn't without its flaws. For starters, if you keep choosing to avoid battles in this way, you'll quickly run out of PSI with Ninten. Not only will this prevent you from avoiding battles in the future, but this will also put you at a pretty considerable disadvantage in these battles because you'll no longer have access to Ninten's combative and supportive psychic abilities. I should mention that the only other person on your team who can use any PSI abilities at all is Anna, so wasting all the PSI on one of two users comes at a pretty big risk. It's also worth mentioning that the game doesn't tell you what the new spells you learn actually do, and if your experience is anything like mine, you'll try to experiment with a new spell, only to be told that the spell failed and be left feeling discouraged from using random spells again in the future. This means that it's completely possible for players to not even realize they have the option to escape battles with Fourth Dimension Slip at all. Even still, why should you have to wait to reach level 14 to finally get the ability to not participate in the battles that are being needlessly shoved down your throat? On top of all of this, much like the run option, Fourth Dimension Slip doesn't do anything to prevent the encounters. It simply offers you a way out. And so that brings me to one last solution, the Repel Ring. The Repel Ring is an item that, when used in the overworld, will prevent encounters from occurring. This is the perfect solution that we've been waiting for. As you could probably guess though, this too comes with one big drawback. While there's nothing wrong with the Repel Ring per se, the problem is that getting a Repel Ring will take up a precious inventory slot in your very limited bag. The bag, which holds all of your items, is way too small for anyone to actually function properly in this game. You see, the bag only comes with 8 slots for items. That's not a whole lot when you consider everything you need to keep with you in the bag. Healing items, weapons, convenience items like bread or repel rings, all of these will take up a slot. And on top of this, there are countless times when you need to keep key items on you for story progression. For example, if you don't have your grandfather's journal with you, you won't be able to ever reach Magic Hand, meaning you are essentially forced to keep an otherwise useless item with you for a large chunk of the game, with your game progression being blocked if you choose to deviate from this requirement. It doesn't take very long for the bag to fill up, and unfortunately there isn't any way to increase your bag size limit beyond 8. However, as you add additional members to your party, they'll each actually come with their own separate bag with another 8 slots you can use. This is actually a godsend, but it takes so long to reach the first party member, Lloyd, that you'll already have had to throw away several of your items, or otherwise you'll have had to backtrack all the way back home to have your sister hold on to some items for you. And it's worth mentioning that on your long journey home, you'll once again be greeted with the endless stream of encounters. Even after you add members to your party, the game still manages to feel incredibly limited on how many items you can carry. The amount of items I had to just waste by throwing them out is insane. At one point, you reach a guy who offers you the chance to drive his tank, but only if you manage to acquire 10 tickets, which you gain by going for rides in his plane. Each ticket, however, takes up a slot in somebody's bag, meaning that you will essentially have to dump out your pockets and make room for 10 otherwise useless items if you want to continue the game. I cannot exaggerate just how annoying this gets. But enough about the bag for now. There is an even bigger issue to discuss, and that's the game's general lack of direction. Now I will say this, modern Nintendo games have been criticized fairly heavily lately for over-explaining everything and holding the player's hand to the point that it feels condescending. For years now, players have been begging Nintendo to go back to letting the player figure some things out on their own, and I agree with this sentiment wholeheartedly. There's absolutely no need to tell the player exactly what to do at every given opportunity. Sometimes the wonder is in finding things out for yourself. But a game like Mother has the complete opposite problem. Not only does Mother refrain from telling you what you should be doing, it also actively tries to hide what you should be doing. Itoi explained that he wanted to design a game that was challenging to figure out so that players would feel a sense of accomplishment when they find the next step. And I get that, but good lord did he take this idea to the worst extreme. It's one thing to make a challenging area for players to navigate, it's another thing completely to gatekeep all progress behind menial and arbitrary tasks. Let me explain. As I mentioned in the plot section of the video, Mother's journey consists of you seeking out the melodies of Queen Mary's Forgotten Song. This task, however, is insufficiently explained to the player, making the main goal of the game feel very unclear. For one thing, the game doesn't really do much to explain just how imperative it is that you actually go find these melodies. Queen Mary's request actually struck me as more of a side quest than anything, because it really doesn't even seem related to Nintendo's goals at all. On top of this, by the time you even hear about this quest, you'll have already potentially missed 3 of the game's 8 melodies. In fact, it's very likely that you did pass these melodies because they're hidden ridiculously well. The locations of this game's melodies were so arbitrary that I needed to look up a guide just to get through them. And I gotta say, without using this guide, this game feels like it would be nearly impossible to complete. Let me give some examples of where these entirely necessary and crucial melodies are located. One of the early melodies resides in a zoo which features a singing monkey. Some of the NPCs will allude to the singing monkey, but it's only casually mentioned. From that, it's up to you to gather that this singing monkey somehow knows the Queen's melody. It's a bit of a stretch, but nothing too ridiculous just yet. But keep in mind that this part of the game takes place before you even meet the Queen, so comments about a singing monkey won't stick out as particularly special or meaningful in any way at this point. When you do go to the zoo, the alien invaders are disrupting the nearby animals, causing all of the animals to escape from their cages. So if you do think to go check the monkey's cage, it won't even be there for you to collect the melody. It's also worth pointing out that the monkey's cage looks nearly identical to all the other cages in the area, but I digress. It's not until you defeat the Starman at the end of the area that you can then backtrack to the monkey's cage and talk to it to receive the melody. This feels counterintuitive, since you'll likely have already checked the cage or perhaps not even think there's any reason to do so, but sure, I guess I can excuse this one. What I can't excuse is the idea that I should be expected to go to the top floor of a department store, spend money to buy a canary egg, not knowing what it does in the first place, commit this random item to taking up a limited inventory slot, carry the egg out of town to a canary village, shimmy behind a stone pillar to reach the egg's mother, and return it to be rewarded with a melody. And you might say, oh, Sketch, you're just mad because you didn't think hard enough. If you were smarter, you would have figured it out. And I'm gonna shut that down now, because by some stroke of luck, I actually did do all of these steps. The only thing I didn't figure out, without looking it up, was that you could actually sneak behind this little stone pillar. This is not a case of me being mad that I didn't figure it out. Far from it. My problem is that it feels unreasonable to expect players to think to do this as a means of continuing the game. Believe it or not though, this isn't even the worst melody you have to locate. By far, the worst offender has to be the desert melody. To get this one, you have to go into the middle of the Yucca Desert in search of a random cactus, because this isn't just any cactus, it's a singing cactus. And as you know by now, based on the singing canary and the singing monkey, if it sings, that means it has to have a melody. Let me ask you this though. Why would I ever look at a vast open desert and think to go pick out a cactus and interact with it? I should mention that even if you do go talk to the cactus, you won't get anything unless you think to use telepathy and waste some of your PSI on the cactus. This is nothing more than the game throwing one last middle finger to the explorative player who actually thought to go check out this random cactus. What indication do you ever receive to go do this? Well, one NPC the next town over has a line of dialogue that happens to mention a cactus. And the man with the plane that I mentioned earlier will fly over the cactus and do a loop on one of his routes. But who would ever see this and think, ah, I should track this very cactus down and read its mind with my telepathic abilities? It's absurd, it's unreasonable, and for as asinine as these damn melodies get to track down, I want to remind you that you might actually think it's only optional because of the way that this is presented. But it's not optional! Doing this is required to beat the game. So based upon all of this, we can conclude that only the most explorative, eagle-eyed, high IQ players will be able to beat this game, right? That's the direction this game seems to be nudging me in. To that, I ask, why does the game actively punish you for exploring? As you know by now, the game's spawn rate is unbearable, which makes map exploration into a laborious task. So why would anyone willingly go wander through the desert for seemingly no reason when they know it'll just result in 30 more tedious battles to get through? While the NPCs in this game have pretty entertaining things to say sometimes, 90% of the time they're just spewing random bullshit. This might be funny at times, but they almost never have anything important to say. So when an NPC mentions something as seemingly random as a whistling cactus, it's just not gonna register that this is the important bit of information I'm supposed to run with. To earn that one NPC who says something useful, you'll have to push through 20 or so that have nothing to offer. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about the NPCs who are programmed to do nothing but cough on you, resulting in Nintendo becoming sick. When you get sick, you'll gradually lose health as you move through the overworld. It's a pretty annoying issue to work through, and the only solution is to backtrack to the nearest doctor and pay his absurd fee. If you're going to gatekeep vital information through the form of mediocre hints offered by your NPCs, the least you could do is not punish the player for interacting with your NPCs. And it'd be one thing if this was a one-time occurrence, where it's like, haha, you got me, he coughed, good one. But there's a couple NPCs that'll do this to you, which is just ridiculous. This game expects you to explore, but actively disincentivizes exploration at every given opportunity. And once more, I have to say that most side paths will result in a dead end. So if you are a more explorative player, which I actually consider myself to be, you'll get discouraged because 9 times out of 10, your attempts to see what the world has to offer will go unrewarded, and will instead result in several more unnecessary encounters. Kinda crazy how this point about enemy encounters keeps coming back, huh? It's almost like it's popping up out of nowhere. And if that annoys you, then maybe you can see why something repeatedly popping up every 10 seconds for no reason might get redundant and annoying. But since 90% of the game will be spent in combat, you would expect the game to have a fun, balanced combat system.
Right? Wrong!
Before I criticize the combat system, let me explain how it works. Mother features turn-based combat, through which you'll choose each party member's action at the beginning of the turn. Your options include using a physical attack, an item, a PSI spell, defending, or running. You select which enemy your party members will target and lock in your moves before watching the plan unfold at the top of each turn. It's pretty simple in theory, but flawed in execution for a few reasons. For one thing, certain enemies feel incredibly overpowered at times, with level jumps at every step of the way. This will result in a constant need to grind levels unless you want to keep dying. If you or a party member dies in combat, you'll have to go to the hospital and pay a rather substantial fee in order to get your partner back on the team. Grinding in this game is a very long and tedious process, but it's actually necessary if you want to stand a chance at some parts of the game. I probably spent hours on grinding, and this was while making use of my emulator's speed up button, so I can only imagine what this is like for those who didn't use one. For how often battles will occur, each battle takes a considerable while to get through. For instance, when Mr. Baddie A, B, C, and D enter the fight, you know you're gonna have to sit through several turns of dialogue without any real threat of losing. 95% of the battles will result in you mashing the speed up button and waiting for it to be over. Still, it's surprisingly easy to stumble into battles that you're not meant to experience yet. On my first playthrough, I got lost and tried to leave a town out of the wrong exit. The result was an encounter with enemies who were super overleveled, wiping me out instantly. Another big issue with the combat system in this game is the generally awful balancing when it comes to party members. Lloyd, I love you bro, but you are by far the worst member on the team. Lloyd does negligible damage with physical attacks and doesn't know how to use any PSI abilities, making his role on the team into the item user, which is already pretty bad in itself. Lloyd can use things like bottle rockets to do more damage than his counterparts, but I mean, you can only carry but so many items at a time, so when you inevitably run out of bottle rockets, what's he supposed to do? He's the weakest team member, so his role will become reduced to wasting his turn to use healing items on the more important team members like Nintendo and Anna. For comparison, let's take a look at Anna. She actually has the strongest damage output with her high level psychic abilities, and also has the strongest potential for healing with her support magic, even gaining the ability to revive people from the dead at a high enough level. Teddy is the fastest and hardest hitting member of the team, which more than makes up for his inability to use PSI. But Lloyd really doesn't contribute enough to justify his spot on the team. While the game offers a lot of PSI spells to mix up your approach to combat situations, as I alluded to earlier, the game doesn't tell you what any of the spells actually do. So there will be a lot of trial and error before you get a sense of what you can actually do in a fight. At its best, the combat system ends up being a screen where you spam the A button in the hopes of getting back to where your journey was interrupted. At its worst, it leads to terribly balanced, sometimes unfair fights that set you back, forcing the player to engage in mindless grinding sessions that will waste hours of their life. Speaking of grinding sessions, let's talk about one of the dumbest things this game decided to do. When you first add Lloyd to your team, it's really cool and exciting. You've made your first friend, you have more inventory space, things feel really good. Then you take a look at his stats and you see, oh, Lloyd is level 1. For reference, Ninten will probably be around level 15 at this point, and the enemies will also be around this level if not higher. They are more than capable of quickly one-shotting Lloyd and forcing you to go spend your hard-earned money to bring him back to life. It's worth noting that you get Lloyd right before you go to Duncan's factory, which will be nearly impossible for you to get through without Lloyd dying unless you go train him up. So that means it's time to go partake in an obnoxiously lengthy grinding session. I should mention that Lloyd will probably still die in these grinding sessions, but you can actually heal for free at Magicant, which is a godsend for grinding. If you don't realize this on your journey, grinding will not only be tedious, but it'll also be really expensive. But it's also the only way to make the rest of the game doable, so there's no choice but to just suck it up and go through it. Now, it sure is annoying that they set Lloyd to level 1 so late in the game, but surely they wouldn't make that mistake again.
Right? Wrong!
Even later in the game, when you add Anna to the team, she's also set to level 1. So once again, it's time to embark on a grinding session and waste another couple hours to get Anna caught up to the rest of the team. I understand that they need to give the party members a base level to start with. But why didn't this level correspond with the level of the enemies for the area you recruit them in? Wouldn't that make much more sense? Suppose the local enemies sit around level 20. Why not have Anna appear around level 15 or so? That way she's not too over-leveled, but she's also not starting from literally square one. But anyway, you continue through the game and eventually you recruit Teddy to the team. By now, you should know exactly what to expect, right? It's time to go ahead and get the grinding session started. Wait a minute. Oh, what the? Bruh. Look, I'm not complaining because this actually saved me a lot of time. But in a way, it almost feels like a slap in the face that Teddy is recruited at over level 20 because that means they were perfectly familiar with the idea of scaling new party members to the enemies of the area. They intentionally made the others level 1 just to mess with you. At least that's how it feels to me. Now, logically speaking, I can wrap my mind around the notion of Teddy being stronger than Lloyd when you recruit him. Teddy has combat experience and has grown up in tougher situations, while Lloyd is weaker and less experienced. But does that mean he should be level 1? Or what about Anna? Sure, she might not have a lot of experience with fighting, but the game straight up tells you that she's really experienced with psychic abilities, so why should she be level 1? There is no reason I can think of for why their levels should be so low, other than the game wanting to prolong your journey by slowing the pacing down to a crawl. And the intentional pace breaking is a pretty big theme in this game. The amount of backtracking this game requires can get pretty excessive at times, but the game does very little to ease this process. There are fast travel options, but they're introduced so late into the game that it almost feels pointless. I will say that the Onyx hook is incredibly useful. It lets you teleport to Magicant whenever you want to, but of course that's at the cost of one of your inventory slots. This also doesn't provide you a way of returning where you teleported from. That's where PSI teleport comes in. Functionally speaking, teleport is cool because it lets you fast travel to any of the towns you've been to before. But this game somehow managed to take a process as simple as fast traveling and make it into a frustrating experience. For starters, teleport is a very easy ability to miss out on altogether. Unlike the other PSI abilities, you don't get it via level up. Instead, there's a specific house you have to visit in Youngtown. Inside this house, there will be a baby in a carriage. If you choose to approach the baby and use telepathy on it, you'll discover that the baby is also gifted with psychic abilities and teaches Ninten how to teleport. Dumb methods of obtaining a vitally necessary ability aside, even after you learn Teleport, it's infuriating to actually pull it off. Teleport requires you to be able to travel in a straight line for what feels like a mile before it actually activates. I mean, it really seems like there are only a couple areas in the game where you actually have enough space to use Teleport, because you'll always hit a wall, a building, a sign, or an NPC that walks in your path. On top of this, Youngtown is the penultimate town in the game, so when you finally learn how to teleport, it's almost too late for it to really even matter. Oh boy, this game is a headache, and it maintains this status all the way through the journey, culminating in its worst, most egregious form at the very end when you reach the game's final area, Mount Itoi. Mount Itoi is by far the worst area in the game for a plethora of reasons. If you take every complaint I've raised thus far and combine them into one final boss of complaints, it would be named Mount Itoi. Not only is Mount Itoi a maze of a cavern, it's also designed so that the camera flips every time you enter a new room, making it all the more frustrating to navigate. This wouldn't be so terrible if it weren't for the insane level jump at this point in the game. I mentioned level jumps being an issue before, but Mount Itoi is by far the worst offender in this department. I should establish the context of this area. See, when Shigesato Itoi was designing the location, Mother was falling behind in its development, so Itoi rushed through this section of the game in an attempt to have the game ready as soon as possible. As a result, he didn't have enough time to test the area's difficulty, and just ran with the assumption that even if the area was hard, players would be able to simply grind up high enough to deal with the difficulty. And boy, I gotta say, that is the most bullshit game design I've ever heard. Truth be told, it doesn't matter how much you grind. The enemies on Mount Itoi will always be a nightmare to deal with. On my first playthrough of the game, I had gotten lost so often and had to battle through enemies each time that Ninten was incredibly overleveled for mostly the entire game, to the point that I would actually just one-shot about every enemy that I ran into. But even that wasn't enough for me to handle Mount Itoi, where I would actually just lose nearly every battle I even attempted. The difficulty of this area gets so intense that it's generally accepted in the community that the optimal way to get through Mount Itoi is to spam 4th dimension slip in every battle to escape, while hoping you don't run out of PSI before finding your way through the labyrinth. Eventually, while you're climbing Mount Itoi, you'll be sent all the way back to the base of the mountain for plot purposes before having to climb the mountain again, this time with Lloyd in Teddy's place.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So after getting through to where you left off, you'll be able to add Eve to the team. And Eve is vitally important, because she's capable of one-shotting literally every enemy in the area. After you add Eve, Mount Itoi becomes a cakewalk. But before you manage to reach this savior of a robot, Mount Itoi is the hardest section of the game, and it's not even close. After you reach the end of Mount Itoi, you reach the mothership and engage in the final boss fight against Gyagis. This might be nitpicking, but the fight against Gyagis is complete bullshit. Before I discuss why I think that is, let me tell you about what I think makes for a good final boss. The final boss should test the player on everything they've learned on their journey up to that point. It should be challenging, but fair in the sense that you're equipped with what you need to defeat them through your experiences and the skills that you've developed along the way. There is no problem with the final boss being difficult, but it should never come across as a cheap shot, because theoretically, everything the boss throws at you should be some variation of a hurdle you've overcome on your journey already, even if it's a ludicrously difficult permutation of said hurdle. So what does the Gyagis boss fight entail? Well, you can try to your heart's content, but you will never be able to defeat Gyagis by force. Despite the game telling you that he takes damage from your attacks, the truth is that he is completely impervious to all damage. Regular attacks, items, and even offense-based PSI abilities will have no effect on him. Not only does this blindside the player by abandoning the pre-established combat system, it also deceives the player with the false illusion that Gyagis is vulnerable to damage. He isn't, and so the game's already failed to test the player on what they've learned. Despite Gyagis not taking any damage, he certainly deals a lot of damage and is capable of hitting all 3 party members at the same time, meaning that most of the fight is going to be spent with Ninten and Anna spamming healing magic while Lloyd spams medkits. So how do you win this fight? Well, optimally, you should use PSI Shield Beta on turn 1 because that cuts Gyagis' damage output in half. From there, you sort of just hit the defend button and heal as necessary for several turns. I should mention that up to this point, I almost never used the defend button because it never really came into play, and I didn't even know what PSI Shield Beta was because the game never told me, nor did it ever seem like it was worth using over an attacking move with my strongest character. You may recall from the plot summary that you defeat Gigas by singing the 8 melodies to him. But how would one even do that? I've become very familiar with this game's combat menu since I've spent hours in here across thousands of battles. I can pretty confidently say there's never been any kind of option that lets you sing anything. Oh, you gotta be kidding me! So after you've turtled up and stalled the fight for long enough, the game will suddenly add a sing feature to the combat menu. The problem is that the game doesn't really make a big deal about this being added. It just sort of shows up mid-battle. And it's incredibly easy to overlook this when 1. You spent the entire game only looking at damage dealing options or the item menu, and 2. You're frantically scrambling to keep your team healed up the whole time. Again, this could be me nitpicking, maybe you would have noticed it right away, but I certainly did not. And even if I did, that's not really the point. The whole fight feels like such a cheap shot since it relies on tactics you'd never use at any other point on the journey. It also feels super anticlimactic to get to the final boss fight only to be told you can't even really fight him. I don't know what else to say. This game is so deeply frustrating that it almost feels like it was intentionally made to be this way. I can't help but wonder if anybody even bothered playtesting this game because it genuinely feels like nobody did at certain points. All of these points I've established synergize with each other and blend to create the ultimate feeling of frustration. I'm conflicted. Mother simultaneously exists as the most charming game I've ever played, as well as the most frustrating game I've ever played. I so desperately wanted to love everything about this game. I wanted to stand in awe at some hidden gem in Nintendo's catalog. I wanted to be able to rave about this game to my friends, but I cannot in good faith recommend this game to anyone unless they have some twisted, borderline masochistic tendencies. After organizing my thoughts in this game, I was left with one final question. Could a game like this ever be fixed? As we all know, Nintendo is known for remaking or remastering some of their classic titles. So is there any room for Mother to embark on its redemption arc through the form of a remastered edition? I marvel at the prospect of Nintendo correcting their faulty product decades later and introducing a new generation to a series that has flown under the radar for far too long. But if I'm being honest with myself, I believe that a game like Mother is beyond redemption. I think the game's flaws are largely irreparable, as they are so deeply interwoven into the game's fabric that it feels almost impossible to separate the game from its flaws. This is not just a game that has a couple occasional erroneous components. No, this is a game that is fundamentally flawed at its core, and I don't imagine any attempt at correcting this will find success without creating a new game altogether. There actually has been a fan remake of the game which attempted to do just this under the name of Mother 25th Anniversary Edition. The goal was to smoothen the experience to make an otherwise charming experience into one that was also playable. ROM hackers set out to polish up the game and remove flaws where they could, and while certain aspects like the graphical improvements were neat, I think the remaster was ultimately unsuccessful at eradicating the game's defects. In full transparency, I have not played this edition of the game, so take my thoughts on it with a grain of salt. However, I have listened to other reviews on it. There's a YouTuber called King K who makes a lot of retrospective analysis content, and he was actually a big inspiration for my decision to make this video. He has a retrospective on Mother, which was based around the 25th Anniversary Edition, and he could explain some of the issues more authentically and in-depth than I could, so I definitely recommend you check his video out if you're interested. But from what I've gathered, the 25th Anniversary Edition aimed to improve gameplay by drastically reducing the absurd enemy spawn rate, supplementing the trade-off of less encounters with a significant boost to experience gained. In theory, this is the solution Mother so desperately needed, but this decision came with a few flaws of its own. While the bombardment of enemies is deeply frustrating, it's also the only way the player can manage to raise enough money to meet the financial demands of the game. This makes the inevitable death of party members who still arrive at level 1 even more costly, as you don't have nearly as much money to spare. Without the encounters, the player becomes broke, and while this notion of removing encounters is nice, it does nothing to correct the game's natural balancing issues. You'll still have to engage in those lengthy grinding sessions, except this time it'll potentially take longer since you're less likely to find the battles you need to engage in to level up. Do you see what I mean when I say that a remaster won't be able to fix this game's issues? Any attempt to do so will just introduce new problems to deal with because the game itself is defective. This is without even addressing other major issues like the game's lack of direction, the overall arbitrary nature of melody locations, the map layout, and everything that is Mount Itoy. I am left to believe that any version of the game that manages to fix all of its issues would no longer be Mother. I say this cautiously, knowing fully well that this game, despite its flaws, is beloved by many, but Mother is destined to be a failure of a game. Mother's identity has become tied to its failures, and unfortunately, there is no real solution. You might be led to conclude that I hate this game, and I could see why you'd arrive at that conclusion. I haven't exactly pulled my punches here, and I presented the game in a pretty negative light so far. But despite how frustrating this game can be, despite how much it infuriated me to my core, Mother will always strike me as a charming and unique experience. I don't hate Mother. I think it's a really beautiful game that has had the unfortunate fate of having its worst aspects consume its identity over time. It's a beautiful, chaotic mess that is perpetually cursed to exist in a blended state of charm and frustration. Obviously, a game like this could never live up to the standards of the 21st century, but as I said at the beginning of all this game wasn't meant to be observed from a modern standpoint. For as warped as this game's experience can get, we should definitely appreciate it for what it stands for in the grand scheme of gaming history. When Mother was released, it was a breath of fresh air for its player base. That air may have grown stale 30 plus years later, but that doesn't mean we should discredit the game's legacy. Mother drew its players in, resonated with them on a new level, and served as a crucial turning point for game design moving forward. Not only did Mother set the foundation for 2 sequels, both of which have received excellent reviews, but it has also served as the inspiration for many other fan games, ROM hacks, and official titles. Among these is the critically acclaimed smash hit Undertale, which took very huge influences from the formula that Mother established. In Nintendo's global legacy, Mother was an important title. This game marked Nintendo's realization that their games' appeal overseas would require a design philosophy moving forward that kept foreign audiences in mind. The process of developing and releasing Mother would cause Nintendo to begin designing games not only around Japanese culture, but with other cultures in mind as well. This would also mark a rise in the implementation of translation teams to work on translating titles for future releases. These are important developments, and while they certainly would have happened on another title if not for Mother, it is pretty neat that these decisions can be traced back to this particular game. Mother also serves as a rather important point in the history of video game emulation, especially since the English translation was translated and distributed through an emulated ROM. For better or worse, this game has a pretty unique history and experience to it. Mother may be the worst title in its own series, but its legacy is critically important and underrated. It's comforting to know that while this game may have its fair share of issues, the developers were willing to stick with the potential this series established and build upon it through the form of EarthBound and Mother 3. And as for those sequels, well, I suppose that's a story for another video, but for now there isn't too much else to say. This has been a Mother Retrospective. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, you're a real one in my book, cause that was a pretty long video. So seriously, thank you. This is probably the hardest I've worked on any project in my life, which is saying a lot since I just graduated from college a few months ago. That being said, this was my first time making a video on this scale. I know it was very different from my previous videos, but if it's something you enjoyed and want to see more of, the best way to let me know is by leaving a like and maybe dropping me a friendly comment. I'd really appreciate it. It's been a personal goal of mine to invest much more time and care into my videos than I have in the past, and I really hope that came across in this video. While I do have the next few video ideas in mind, it will of course take a considerable amount of time for me to prepare them to a suitable standard, but just trust that I'm going to be working hard behind the scenes to get the next upload to you as soon as possible. If you want to keep up with me in the meantime, please consider following me over on Twitch. I always have a pretty good time hanging out with you guys and getting to talk, and I have a lot of big plans for upcoming streams that you won't want to miss out on. You can of course find the link to my Twitch channel in the description below. Anyway, I've taken up enough of your time today, so with that, it has been me, SketchAV, gonna get up out. Peace!